That may or may not come out as a separate recording. That was my goal, so I could separate 12 from 13. We'll see. If not, I'll just post it as an overlap. So if you're wondering where the beginning of 12 is, it's probably in the module for 13 or vice versa. Okay. So ultimately, when you take a look at the spinal cord, it's going to be going from the foramen magnum, right, which is basically the large hole at the base of the skull, and it's going to go all the way down to the lumbar vertebra. And it's going to basically have different segments, cervical, thoracic, lumbar, and sacral, very similar to the same skeletal breakdowns that we saw as well. And so ultimately, altogether, we'll have 31 pairs of spinal nerves coming off of the spinal cord, innervating the rest of the body. Ultimately, at the lower end, it will end in what's called the conus medullaris, which is this little area right here. Looks like the tip of a sword. And then the cauda equina, which basically means horsetail, is going to be this sort of large structure right here. It actually looks like a horsetail of nerves that basically is at the inferior portion of the spinal cord. Now, when you take a look at the spinal cord, it is wrapped by the same meningeal layers that we saw with the brain. And as a result, I don't want to spend a whole lot of time overlaying that same discussion that we already had with the dura mater, the arachnoid mater, the pia mater. Just point out a couple of things that maybe are jumping out a little bit more differently. So when you take a look at the dura mater, this basically is going to be continuous with the epineurium, which is the outer layer of a nerve bundle. The arachnoid mater we talked about is that little cobwebby area, and the pia mater in the spinal cord will actually form what's called the filum terminale, which we actually had in this particular image here, which is this sort of terminal area that you see down here, the filum terminale. So that's basically and that's down there by the coccyx as well. Now, remember, there's spaces associated with this as well. And so the spaces are actually more prominent in the spinal cord than they are in the brain. And so above the dura mater, you're going to have the epidural space. This is typically where you would deliver an epidural anesthetic. And so below the dura is the subdural space where you have serous fluid. And we talked a little bit about the subdural area in the last chapter. And then below the arachnoid space is the subarachnoid region. This is where your cerebral spinal fluid is flowing, where we just talked about that little yellow area where the cerebral spinal fluid is kind of flowing through all those little spider webs before it goes to that dural sinus. And so those are the spaces. A subdural hematoma is pooling of blood in that subdural space. Okay. So that's oftentimes something that happens if you take a blow to the head and you rupture blood vessels and you start getting blood pooling in that subdural area. So that's kind of what it looks like in terms of your structure. So the dura mater is going to be this outermost area right here. So that's your dura mater. Now, above that is your epidural space. This is basically where you would put the needle for an epidural. Okay. Now, underneath that is going to be the arachnoid mater, that little thin yellow line that you can barely see. That little thin yellow line, that's going to be your arachnoid mater. And then the subdural space is they're trying to show is below that. So they should probably blow this up. But basically, you can see that little gap between the dura and the little yellow line of the arachnoid mater. That's the subdural space, very tiny, right? So there's not a really huge space there. And then below the arachnoid mater is a much larger space, which is the arachnoid space. And that's kind of all this open area in here. And that's generally where your cerebral spinal fluid is circulating. And then the actual spinal cord itself is covered by the pia mater, which is just like with the brain, that kind of little wrapping that basically wraps around the spinal cord itself. So when you take a look then at the spinal cord, we're gonna see a couple of different pieces of the spinal cord. But the first places that we want to go is a cross-section of the spinal cord to get an idea of what the different pieces are. First of all, the spinal cord, when you cut it in half, looks like it has a giant butterfly in the middle of it. And so you have both gray matter and you have white matter. And so in addition to that, you can mark the anterior and posterior sections of the spinal cord with these a fissure. So you have an anterior median fissure associated with the spinal cord, a deep fissure. And that is basically going to be this guy right here. That deep groove is the anterior median fissure. And then you have the posterior median sulcus, which is a little bit shallower than the fissure. And so the sulcus, you can see, is right here. So it's just a little bit of a dip right there on the posterior side, not nearly as deep as the anterior median fissure. And this kind of separates it into right and left halves of the spinal cord. Now then, the white matter of the spinal cord is associated with myelinated axons that forms these tracks that move up and down the white matter region of the spinal cord in what we refer to as columns of the spinal cord. So you have ventral, dorsal, and lateral columns, and typically these are broken up into tracks or fasciculi or pathways. And there's very specific axons that move through these different tracks. Now the gray matter is basically the butterfly. This is basically areas of cell bodies and some dendrites and axons. It's not like there's not axons there. It's just that there's not as many myelinated axons in this particular gray matter area as there are in the white matter area. And so typically where the white matter was broken up into columns, dorsal, ventral, and lateral columns, the gray matter is broken up into horns. So you have dorsal, ventral, and lateral horns, or posterior, anterior, and lateral horns. Typically, the lateral ones are associated with the autonomic nervous system for the most part. So we oftentimes don't really take a look at it very closely if we're looking at the somatic side of the cord. Now then, in addition to this, you're going to see what's called commissures. And I mentioned this before in the last chapter, but basically a commissure is just like this little isthmus, this connection that connects both left and right halves. And so ultimately, in the commissure, you'll have a gray region that will have a central canal in the center where you circulate cerebral spinal fluid. And then you'll have a white region as well. Now, another thing you're going to see in a cross-section of a spinal cord are the roots that will essentially become spinal nerves. So the spinal nerves arise from the rootlets, and then they'll basically form the roots themselves. And so when you take a look at the roots, you're going to have on a cross-section a dorsal root, which is typically carrying sensory information into the spinal cord. And then below that, you'll have the ventral root, which is carrying the motor response leaving the spinal cord to the effector. And so generally, when the two roots merge together, they form the spinal nerve. And the spinal nerves are what we learn about in, say, for instance, lab tonight, when we're looking for things like the median nerve or the ulnar nerve or the radial nerve, right? So the dorsal root is easy to locate on the spinal column because it has a ganglion, a swelling. And this ganglion is basically an area of processing. And this is kind of what it looks like. So here you can see you have the anterior median fissure, which is right here, and the posterior median sulcus, which is up here. Your white matter is broken into columns. So this one is the lateral column. So these are your laterals. And then you have your dorsal column. And then you have your ventral or anterior column. I want to switch terms on you because I just changed terms on you. So that's your ventral or anterior column. Then your butterfly, your gray matter butterfly, follows through the commissure, which is this little itty bitty piece right here that connects the right and left sides with your central canal in the middle. But these are associated with the horns. So for instance, in this area right here, that's going to be your dorsal or posterior horn. And then below it is going to be your lateral. And then underneath that is going to be your ventral horn. And so those are the subdivisions of your white and gray matter. When you take a look at the rootlets, coming from the horns are going to be little rootlets of nerves bringing information to the, in this case, the ventral root, which is this guy right here. So this is your ventral root. And the dorsal root, which is bringing information, sensory information, into the dorsal side. And so the dorsal root ganglion, or the DRG, is this little swelling that marks the dorsal root. Now, as you start to move away from the spinal nerve, the dorsal and the ventral roots will merge together to create your spinal nerve. And so that's basically your spinal cord. Now, when you take a look at the spinal cord, you can see that the white matter, the columns, lateral, dorsal, and ventral columns, are all subdivided into ascending and descending tracts. So, for instance, the ascending tracts, which are basically taking information up the spinal cord toward the brain, are in green. And so that basically shows you the direction of information as it's leaving through the spinal cord. The descending tracts, which are bringing information from the brain to the target, are basically in purple, and they're basically moving downward. You may recall when we were talking about the brain, we talked about it very quickly. We talked about things like the spinothalamic tract, right? Those are these tracts, so these ascending tracts that are coming up through the spinal cord. And so this is basically how you're transferring information. So you essentially have specific tracts that are designated and dedicated to basically moving specific types of information from one area of the body to the next. So your dorsal root ganglion, essentially a collection of cell bodies, or pseudo unipolar in nature. These guys are going to be bringing in sensory information, and then they're going to be moving that into the spinal cord itself. So you can see sensory neurons basically are moving through the dorsal root. They're being processed in the dorsal root ganglion and relayed into the anterior and lateral horns of the spinal cord's gray matter. And so at this particular point, typically what happens is you get some sort of a response. So you either basically get a response of this particular area that leads out the ventral side in response to whatever came in, right? So you integrate that and you move that out, or you relay it through what's called an interneuron, and then you pass that through the ventral root on to the effector. Okay, let's take a look at reflexes. So reflexes basically are an automatic response to a stimulus. Doesn't have to go to the brain for you to be able to figure it out. What happens is basically it's a neural pathway that goes from the sensory receptor to the sensory neuron. So you have a receptor out in your skin, for instance, that receives a stimulation. It goes through a sensory neuron to an interneuron, to a motor neuron, to the effector organ. But typically, this is all in the spinal cord. So normally what happens is when your sensory information comes in to the spinal cord, it goes up an ascending track to the appropriate region of the brain, gets processed by the brain, some sort of a decision about a response is made, and then it goes down the descending tracks of the spinal cord to your effector, to whatever muscle it is that you happen to be talking to. And then from there, it'll go out the ventral root on its way to the muscle to tell the muscle to contract. In which case, I'm telling my hand to pull yourself off of the table. And I did. Now, that's the normal pathway. The brain is in charge of receiving inputs and sending out the message. In a reflex, you short circuit that by basically going directly to the spinal cord and then right back to the muscle. So the brain's not involved in this decision. It is aware of it, but it is not involved in it. And that's a reflex arc. So when you take a look at reflexes, you can classify them in a couple of different ways, either by the number of synapses that they make. For instance, a monosynaptic reflex is one that does not have any interneurons that it has to relay through. A polysynaptic has interneurons. You can also categorize it based on development. For instance, innate are a part of normal development. Learned is basically where you have repeated activities, kind of the same way you do with your cerebral your brain, right? Where you basically burn neural pathways in order to learn new information. You can also categorize them by effector type, right? So somatics are essentially associated with skeletal muscle. Autonomic are associated with the core visceral systems, right? So for instance, the vagus nerve is in charge of those autonomic reflexes. Or on location and integration. So cranial reflexes are associated with reflexes to the brain. Spinal reflexes are associated with reflexes to the spinal cord. Now, this is a basic reflex arc. So ultimately, what's going to happen in the first step is a receptor somewhere in your body or your skin is going to pick up a stimulus, and that's going to create action potentials, just like we learned about in chapter 11. Then what's going to happen is that sensory neuron is going to conduct that action potential. It's going to go through the dorsal root ganglion into the spinal cord. And then from the spinal cord, so it's basically going to take this pathway. It's going to go through the dorsal root, through the ganglion, into the spinal cord. Once it's in the spinal cord, it's going to go to the integra ion center, the integration center. Sorry. That's supposed to be a T. And then ultimately, what's going to happen is, in this particular example, there's an interneuron that relays that. So that's this little purple guy right here, right? So that would be referred to as a polysynaptic reflex, right? Because there's multiple relays in there. And so that's going to basically be relayed ultimately through an interneuron. And then from that interneuron, it's going to synapse with a motor neuron. And that's this purple guy. Okay, I don't want to edit this. Thank you. And so this purple neuron is then going to carry the outgoing motor message through the ventral root, and then it's going to send it out to the effector, which is the muscle, and it's going to basically cause your muscle to move. So notice it's a short circuit. So it goes straight to the spinal cord and back. Instead of going to the spinal cord, up to the brain, you think about it a little bit, you send out a message, it comes back down the spinal cord, and then out to the muscle, right? So that takes a little bit longer. So you have several different types of reflexes. The first one we're going to talk about is the stretch reflex. So typically inside your muscles, there are a special type of muscle cell called spindle cells, muscle spindle cells. And these guys are going to be responsible for responding to stretch. They're a type of stretch receptor. And so they can basically respond to stretch. They're wired up to very specific motor neurons. They're not basically connected neurally the same way that other motor neurons are, right? So these are special subdivisions. And so they're wired by what's called gamma motor neurons. These are small diameter neurons. And so what they do is they control the sensitivity of these muscle spindle fibers. And so ultimately, the sensory neurons will essentially contact these sort of non-contractile centers. You're not lifting a load with these muscle fibers. These are special. And so they're designed to do slightly different things. So then what happens is these neurons that are attached will basically synapse with a special type of spinal cord motor neurons called alpha motor neurons. And this will cause the muscle to contract. So basically what happens is the spindle cells will stretch and communicate that to the spinal cord, which will then cause, by alpha, the muscles to contract. So this is kind of what it looks like. So a stretch reflex, this is basically like, for instance, when you hammer the patellar ligament, ultimately what happens is muscle spindle receptors in the muscles will stretch, and that activates the stretch reflex, right? But this is just that sensory piece of muscle fiber. So the axons of these neurons will then go to the spinal cord, And these will synapse directly with the alpha motor neurons in the spinal cord. And from there, the spinal cord, by way of the alpha motor neurons, will stimulate the muscles where the muscle spindle is embedded. So that's basically going to be in this direction. So essentially what's going to happen is the muscle spindle is going to send that to the spinal cord, and then the spinal cord is going to send the alpha motor neurons to the muscle. And then once it gets to the muscle itself, it'll contract. And that's going to be the reaction of the alpha motor neurons themselves. And so ultimately then once you kind of do this contraction, then what happens is you contract the muscle spindles just a little bit so you can reset the system so you can detect further stretch. So what you have is you have the bulk muscle fibers, which we talked about in chapter 9, that are shortening to contract and to create tension. But within them, you have intermixed these muscle fiber, these muscle spindle cells, which are a little bit different. And their job is to sort of sense the amount of stretch of the actual muscle itself. And it communicates that with the spinal cord so that you can basically so that you can basically regulate the contraction of the muscle in response to what the muscle is actually doing, the stretch of the muscle. Does that make sense? It's kind of hard to explain sometimes, but it's kind of like a sensory outpost that tells the spinal cord what's happening in the muscle so that it can send stimulation to contract the muscle accordingly. Okay. A lot of words. Okay. Anyway, the Golgi tendon reflex is a little bit different, right? So the Golgi tendon organ is basically a group of encapsulated nerve endings. And so this will be oftentimes found in collagen, usually collagen of a tendon. And it's usually like it's in a tendon area where it's near the muscle region. And so what these guys are designed to do is it prevents damage to the tendons from over excessive loads, right? So oftentimes you think, well, wait a minute, if I pick up something too heavy, what's to keep me from basically breaking my tendons, right? Snapping my tendons. Well, it's this particular reflex right here, the Golgi tendon reflex, right? For instance, if you have too much weight and you all of a sudden suddenly drop that heavy weight, that's typically this particular reflex that's creating this sort of drop, if you will, clean and jerk kind of an idea. So your Golgi tendon organ will basically send the information, the sensory information, to the sensory neurons, which will then relay to inhibitory neurons that inhibit the alpha motor neurons. These are the ones telling the muscle to contract. And then that causes the muscle to relax. So basically what you're saying is, listen, you've got way too much load on your tendon. If you continue to carry this much weight, you are going to break your tendon, and that's not a good thing. And so this is a reflex that causes the automatic disconnect of that particular contraction response so that your muscle stops contracting and it relaxes before it does damage to the tendon. Okay. So it's kind of what it looks like. So basically, as your muscle contracts, the tendon is going to stretch. That's basically what's happening in this particular area. And so this is going to send action potentials in the sensory neurons coming from the Golgi tendon organs, which are located in this particular tendinous area. And they're sensing all this information, sending it to the sensory neuron, which is on its way to the spinal cord, and then goes through the dorsal side. And then what's going to happen is it'll move through the dorsal root, and then it'll enter in the dorsal gray horn. And then ultimately the integration center will inhibit, it'll send sensory information to inhibit the inhibitory interneuron, which will then stimulate the flexors of the hamstring, which opposes the action, causes the muscles to relax instead. And so this is kind of like a blown up view of that Golgi tendon organ where you have a lot of this innervation connected to that region of the tendon that would most likely be induced or exposed to the most stress when you have an overtension on that particular muscle itself. Okay. So the withdrawal reflex. So basically, this is a situation, a reflex that will take a body limb from a painful stimulus. Like if you're stepping on something sharp, you don't have to think about it, you automatically do that. And so this is a situation where you have two different types of innervation associated with this. You have a relaxation innervation, that's the reciprocal innervation, which is going after the extensor muscles. So if the flexors contract, the extensors will relax. This is also the same thing that's involved in the stretch reflex, right? As one thing stretches, the other one contracts, that sort of thing. The cross extensor reflex is an interesting one because this is a withdrawal reflex that's essentially initiated in one of the lower limbs, but then it crosses over as a reflex into the opposite lower limb. And so if you have a reflex in one, you get also coordination in the opposite limb. So let's take a look at these withdrawal reflexes here. So ultimately, you have your pain stimulation, you're stepping on the tack. Your sensory neuron is going to be taking this through the sensory neuron. It's going to go through the spinal cord. And then notice you're going to be hitting an excitatory interneuron, which is then going to be relaying that information through an alpha motor neuron to the muscles. It's going to cause the hamstrings to flex, which is going to pull your leg up off of the tack. And so this is basically, this is kind of a blow up of this area. So where you can see the pain associated with the tack is being relayed by pain receptors in your foot and dumped directly into the sensory neuron. So that's your withdrawal reflex. Now, the reciprocal innervation, right, which is basically the relaxation of an extensor while you are contracting or flexing the hamstrings, is kind of a slightly different situation. So notice you still get the sensory neuron, which is going to be sending that information to the spinal cord. Now it's going to be sending a CC to the brain. Oh, by the way, you're stepping on a tack. I just figured I'm going to take care of it here because, you got other things to think about. So I'm just going to go and pull your foot off the tack before you have to think about that and have this tack driving all the way through your foot. And so what happens is it goes through an excitatory interneuron. And then in this particular case, the alpha motor neurons are going, and while they're going to the hamstring flexors to pull your foot off, the quads, the extensors, at the same time, are now basically being told to relax, right? So the extensors are doing just the opposite, which makes a lot of sense, right? Because these are antagonistic muscle groups. As a flexor contracts, the extensors relax. And so if you're going to be reflexively causing the flexors to contract, you don't want to also have the extensors contracting, because then that's like pulling on your arm like a tug of war, right? So what you want is you want to say, okay, you know what? Flexors contract, and then your extensors, you guys have to relax. That way we don't have any oppositional force against each other, and you have one coordinated movement of pulling your foot up off the tack. Does that make sense? So that's basically what we're looking at when we're looking at this kind of regulated, kind of multiple things going on. Now, when you have crossed extensor reflex, this is going to be something kind of a little bit different. This is basically going to be a relay to the opposite leg, right? So in this particular case, you're still stepping on the tack, by the way, so I'm still going to keep you on that tack for a little while longer. And so what happens is you have your normal conduit. So notice what's happening is you go up through your sensory neuron into your spinal cord. You're CCing your brain. By the way, you're stepping on a tack. But now notice what's happening is you're interfacing with two different interneurons, or actually one that kind of crosses over. So the first interneuron is the excitatory interneuron that's associated with our alpha motor neuron as it goes out the ventral side and then causes those hamstring groups to contract. That one we know about. However, the other one is interfacing or synapsing with an excitatory interneuron that's crossing over through the commissure, right, that little isthmus area, to the other side, and then its alpha motor neuron is going from the other side, and it's going to be innervating with the quad group of the extensors on your other leg. So as you are basically pulling one leg up, the idea is the other leg has to maintain your integrity. So you can't just tell one leg to pull up. The other leg has to do something too, because now all of a sudden your weight is now all on that leg. And so your nervous system has to simultaneously tell one leg to pull up. That's the withdrawal reflex, while at the same time telling your other leg through this through this cross to basically say, listen, you know what? You guys need to hang on because your whole body weight now is on your left leg. So notice the coordination. You're coordinating multiple things happening at essentially and effectively the same time. So ultimately then when you take a look at reflexes, your reflexes are all very similar in the sense that they basically short circuit their way through the spinal cord. So they all have basically the same kinds of inputs. You have some sort of a sensory reception that generally speaking will go to the brain through the ascending tracts, and then the brain will obviously do something, and then the information will come through the descending tracts, down through the purple tracts, and then out the ventral to the effectors. And so generally speaking, these effectors will be communicated to by neurotransmitters like we saw in chapter 9, right through the neuromuscular junction using acetylcholine. And some of these will be either EPSPs or IPSPs, whatever those are. Right, so this is excitatory postsynaptic action potentials and inhibitory postsynaptic potentials. They either induce an action potential or they don't. So then when you take a look at your spinal nerves, basically they are bundles of axons covered by Schwann cells and connective tissue, and they have layerings. Just like we saw in chapter 11, right? They have the layerings. It's kind of like a review of that. Remember, the endoneurium is the part that surrounds the individual neurons. The perineurium is the part that surrounds the fascicles, and the epineurium is the part that surrounds the entire nerve itself, right? So for instance, your endoneurium is this little blue piece that surrounds each nerve. The perineurium is basically surrounding the fascicle, and the epineurium is surrounding this bundle of fascicles, which essentially is your nerve. That is basically a little bit of chapter 11 review, very quick, right? And so this is basically the organization, and we'll take a look at the organization before we start digging into the deep woods. But basically you have 31 pairs of spinals. The first are the cervical nerves, basically C1s through C4. And then you have the brachial nerves, which are C5 to T1. Your thoracic nerves, basically you have 12 pairs of thoracics, 8 pairs of cervical, 5 lumbars, 5 sacrals, and 1 coccygeal. Right, so this is basically your lumbars right here. And then your sacrals are L4 to S5, and your coccygeal are S5 and down. And so those are your major pieces. The cool thing about this is you can actually map where these nerves control sensation in your body by a dermatomal map. So you can see the cervical, that is from C1 to roughly C8 or so, is covering and innervating the areas in blue. The thoracics are covering your trunk, both front and back, that trunk area. And then the red portion is your lumbar, the front of your legs, and the sacral area is the genitals and basically your booty stripe on the back going down your legs, right? This is important because oftentimes when you look at spinal cord injuries, these are the areas that you can see very distinctly. Depending on which area or which vertebra you damage, you can actually see which particular area, which stripe of this particular area is paralyzed, where the paralysis starts. Okay, so we will then start taking a look at the structure of the roots and the spinal nerves including looking at the ramus. And we'll start that next time because we are at our witching hour. So take a bit of a break. We'll reconvene here in lab for our nerve lab in a few minutes.